Meeting to order. Special counsel, please call the roll.
Director Pacho,
Here?
Director Scholas, Director Anthrop,
Here.
Director Kennedy,
Here.
Councilmember King, Ms. Shine. Here. Mr. Davis. Here. Ms. Rebecca Jonesy. Mr. McBool. Chair, we do have a quorum, and we'd like to note that Director Howard is in attendance as well.
Okay, thank you. We have a presentation item today in addition to an action item. So I will proceed to ask Mitchell, welcome again, to present the Employees Retirement System of Surgeon Water Board of New Orleans Actuarial Report.
All right, thank you, Mr. Pacho. Good morning, everybody. Today, we'll be presenting the results of the January 1, 2024 actuarial valuation, and we'll just dive right into that. So we'll look at the valuation results, the recent ADC, which is the actuarially determined contribution. We'll talk more about that and the recent contribution history. And we'll talk about what's next, including this year's benefit statements. And of course, have time for Q&A at the end, but please ask questions if I go, if you have any questions. And this presentation shouldn't take too long. So first, we'll just review plan membership over the last year. On the left are the members as of 1/1/23, and then the members as of the beginning of this year in the right-hand column, and split into the categories of active employees. And you'll see that those grew by 6 or 7% from 1,113 to 1,190 over the past year. The vested terminated population, these are former employees who were vested in their pension at the time they terminated employment but are not yet eligible to retire, as well as they did not withdraw their employee contributions following their termination, so they're entitled to a benefit in the future. The non-vested terminated employees, which vary a lot from year to year, and the reason being that there's a lag between when they terminate and when they receive their return of employee contributions. So we keep them in the plan and in the liabilities until their contributions are returned to them. And then the retiring beneficiary population, which stayed relatively stable year over year. And as you can see, there's a total of getting close to 2,500 members in the plan as of the beginning of this year. All of these results are also presented in more detail in the actuarial valuation report. One other note is of the 908 retirees and beneficiary, presently there are 63 drop retirees who are in their drop participation period. So they have entered drop status but are still working, and at the end of their participation period, they'll get paid out their drop account and begin their annuity. And again, that number varies a lot year to year as people enter that population and exit. The actuarial accrued liability, this is what we measure to compare to the plan assets and determine what the contribution should be. And this slide takes you from the liability last year to the liability at the beginning of this year, $357 million last year. You see it grew to $363 million at the beginning of this year on the bottom row. And what makes that change over time happen is the normal cost. That is the obligation for the liability that is accrued by the active employees. So they get another year of service over the past year and increase their accrued benefit, and that's the obligation associated with that. The interest cost, that's simply, we're discounting expected future benefit payments at the 7% discount rate, and the discount rate period's a year shorter as you get a year, as a year passes. So liability grows with interest, and that's the biggest line item there of growth. Actual gains and losses of $2 million, that's the difference. We have all these assumptions, rates of retirement, termination, how long people will live, et cetera. And that's the difference between what actually happened over the course of the year and what we expected to happen. So a relatively small percentage of the total $350 million liability was a loss of $2 million. We didn't change any assumptions this past year, so that line item is blank. Benefit payments, of course, as those are paid, that reduces the obligation. And that number is comprised of the annuity payments plus those drop retirees who finished their participation in the drop period and received a drop payment. And that's the part that varies the most year over year, is how many people are exiting the drop and receiving a payment. The annuity payments are roughly 23, 24 million of that 27, and that extra 3 is roughly what got paid out in drops this past year. And then lastly, city and other transfers. These are folks, if people come from NOMERS and work here, there's a reciprocity agreement where their obligation under that plan is transferred to this plan, and assets associated with that are transferred as well. There are folks who may come here who were in the lasers plan or another plan, and other items, folks who may repurchase service if they worked here before and came back and work again. So that comprises that 1.4 million. And again, we went from 357 to 363 million over the course of the last year.
Mitchell?
Yes,
you
sir.
said we had 63 in drop?
63 members in the drop who are presently still working and have entered the drop. And so the drop period's usually 5 years. And so some of them will exit this year and receive their payment. Some will exit 2, 3, 4 years from now. This slide looks at the assets year over year, and it gives you a 2-year look for 2022 and 2023. So the left-hand column is really taking you from January 1, 2022 to January 1, 2023, and the right is from 1/1/23 to 1/1/24. And if we just look at the right-hand column, you started the year at 223 million and finished with 236. And again, there were contributions from the employer of 12.1 million during the year, employee contributions of 3.4. This year, 11% return is shown in the bottom row, so a $23 million investment return as opposed to the prior year of almost 39 million in investment losses. And benefit payments were relatively stable year over year, which means, in part, that the drop folks exiting the drop were relatively constant in the last couple of years. City and other transfers just varies year to year depending on how many folks come in and out of the plan as transfers. But the big story is, a year ago, 14% losses. In this past year, 11% return. So now, as we'll talk more in the next slide or so, you'll see how we smooth the assets to reduce the volatility in the employer contribution. And we'll talk more about that. One other item of note, the employee contributions appear as though they decreased year over year. That's not quite accurate. In 2022, there were 3.5 million in employee contributions, but 500,000 of that, as shown in the footnote, was just the way those were accounted that year. Member contributions for transfers in were put in that bucket. So it really went from 3 million to 3.4 million year over year, as opposed to looking like it decreased to $100,000.
I wanted to ask you why it was such a big decrease in the asset from 274 to 223. What was the?
That's the investment return for the year. So the market underperformed in 22. We're, as actuary, we don't manage the assets. We're on the liability side. So that would really be for your investment manager to kind of present to you.
It's a serious dip of 18%.
Yeah, it was a bit.
That mean whatever gains you get, it's already offset it.
Yeah.
Those are the presentations from Kwaku. He explains the market value and the changes.
No, I understand. I'm just asking, because it's a serious concern. If we are losing 18% of our asset, then we have to look at the actual, asset managers to make sure we are shielded from market volatility.
Yes, and so you all have the quarterly meetings, I think, with Kwaku and
We do, yeah.
and do all that evaluation, your due diligence there, and change funds and things like that. But 2022, you were not alone in the market with that.
But then again, you have, fireproof investments.
Sure, you're investing. Your portfolio is doing two things. One, it is attempting to get returns to help close the shortfall of the funding of the plan, and secondly, to have stable cash flow to take care of the 25 million a year in benefit payments. So That's all built into the funding or the investment policy, those considerations. But as you're right, there's volatility. And so as actuaries, we try and take or minimize that volatility as to how it affects the year-over-year contribution so you can budget better and not have wild swings in that contribution year over year.
One thing to help you, the overall market was worse in '22. It beat the market by 4 or 5 points.
Yeah, yes, sir.
That's a good point. And this next slide, this is how we try and smooth that volatility in the market returns. So the red line is the market returns over the last 15 years. And you can see there's some dips there in 2019. You know, a lot of that was the COVID and the ensuing market volatility. From that, as we just talked about, during 2022, you had the market swing again of the minus 14% return. And what's missing here is, you know, we've gone out of it in our 15-year window, but in 2008, you also had the dip there. So you recovered from that, obviously. But what we're doing with the actuarial value of assets, or the sort of the blue-green line there, the AVA, we're doing a 7-year smoothing of investment gains and losses. So when you have a big loss, we recognize that over a 7-year period, and we have a big gain, we recognize that over a 7-year period. But that creates that smoother return over time, which smooths the contribution over time, as opposed to going, oh, if we just marked assets to market instead of smoothing, your contribution might go from 11 million one year to 7 million the next to 18, you know, and instead it's a more stable change in the contribution year over year. But if there's going to be some volatility, you can't avoid it altogether. But right now, the amount of cumulative asset losses, so there's more losses and gains over that 7-year period, and 18.7 million is being deferred and not yet recognized, which is why the AVA on the far right and at 1124 is above the market values, because we're deferring the recognition of those losses, but they'll get recognized in time. This chart here is a number of things going on here. The blue and red bars are comparing the actuarial value of assets to the actuarial liability. Here it's shown as the EAN, or entry age normal, which is the method of measuring liability. But you can just think of it, the red is the accrued liability. And you can see that, you know, assets are less than the market value because the plan's less than 100% funded. And you can see on the right-hand side, this sort of turquoise line is measuring the funded ratio. So the ratio of assets to liabilities. And you can see that's been relatively stable. It dipped from 18 to 19, and really the dip there was we adopted some new assumptions at that time. The biggest assumption was the mortality used to project the expected lifetime of members was very outdated. We talked about that in 2019 when we changed that assumption. And so since then, we haven't changed any assumptions. And so we've had that volatility of the assets and the contributions increasing. But the funded ratios remained relatively stable at close to 70 to 72% over that time. And the funding method will take care of that, and we'll get you to 100% over time. And we'll talk about a little bit why it's been a little flat besides the asset volatility. So when we determine the funding contribution, maybe we'll skip to a couple slides ahead and talk about this first. We look at the normal cost, which is the accrual for the year. We want to make sure the employer contribution or the total contribution covers the growth and liability attributable to the accruals employees earn each year. And we want to amortize that unfunded liability. So you can think of that amortization sort of like paying off a mortgage. You know, you don't pay for your house all at once. You pay principal and interest, and over time you pay off that principal. And one of the concepts there, we're using level dollar amortization just like a mortgage on a house. And the way that goes is in the early years, the bulk of your payment covers interest and very little principal. And over time, you cover more and more principal. So right now, you're paying a lot of interest, and so you're not really changing the funded ratio much. And as you pay off that amortization amount, you'll pay more and more principal, and you'll really, in the later years, boost that funded percentage. So we'll come back now and just talk about what changed in the last year. So there's a new amortization layer. That amortization amount is built in layers. We'll talk about that more. But the new layer is attributable to losses during the last year. And there were about $6 million in losses, and we're measuring losses as the unfunded accrued liability. So we look at the difference between actuarial assets and liabilities last year. We determine what we would expect the unfunded to be, given the growth in interest on that obligation, the expected return on assets, and the payment of the contributions towards paying off that unfunded. And then we remeasure, and there's losses because, as we talked about, there's experience losses. The plan demographics changed in ways we didn't quite expect, as well as the assets don't return quite what we expect. But that generated a $6 million loss, which gets amortized over 25 years and roughly increases the contribution this year by about a $500,000 amortization payment. So that's what that $6 million translates to in terms of additional contribution this year.
But it was a lower total percentage.
Yes, and the reason it's a lower total percentage, so that the dollar of the contribution, dollar amount of the contribution increases, but the percentage decreases this year because payroll grew by 9% year over year. And a lot of that is just driven by 7% growth in the active population. So back on that first slide where there were roughly 1,100 employees last year, there's roughly 1,200 this year, which is roughly a 7% growth. Now, there's also, that doesn't explain all the 9% growth. There's 2% more in payroll for ongoing employees than we expected. And so payroll's higher. When you do the calculation for what the benefit's expected to be, it's going to be higher because it's an average of pay that goes into the formula, and that generates some liability losses. But
Are we building in the next 2.5% that will hit in January for next year when we do next year's?
so when we do next year's, our base pay that we're projecting will be higher, so it's built in that way. But we're not necessarily changing the assumption just because we had a year where it was 2% higher than expected.
Oh, no, across the pay plan, 2.5% will be applied to every.
Oh, you're saying there's expected 2.5? Yeah, so we will be, we will be doing an experience study this year, and we will take into account what you all plan to do with pay, right? So yes, that will be taken into account.
There's an embedded assumption for salary growth.
There absolutely is, right? And so we have an inflationary component, we have a merit and longevity component, and we'll do as I'll talk about at the end, that's one of our other projects this year is an experience study where we, like we did in 2019, we do it every 5 years, and we'll reevaluate all the assumptions and tweak them based on what's actually happened over the last 5 years and what we know to expect to happen based on what the Water Board plans to do for pay increases in the near term, and then we have to make estimates about the medium and long term. But going back to what you were saying, you know, gee, if the dollar amount of the contribution went up, why didn't the percent of pay go up? You know, the contribution to percent of pay. Well, that's because pay grew more than we expected. And as I mentioned, we're doing a level dollar amortization of these amortization layers. And so once we determine it, that amount is fixed. And as pay grows up, it's a smaller percentage of that pay. And so that's really the story of this year. And this slide, it looks at the amortization layers individually. And you can see that the big one is this gray one. That was a transition. So when the new funding policy was adopted in 2021, we took the entire unfunded amount and we amortized it over a 30-year period. And so the other colors there that are much smaller in magnitude, red, that's when we changed the assumptions back in a few years ago. And so there was a layer that had to be amortized for the growth in liability due to the change in assumptions. And the rest are blue, darker blue, and those are just gains and losses. So you can see at the bottom, there's 0 and then there's -10. And so anything that's below the 0 was a gain that's being amortized, and anything stacked on top at the top of the graph here is a loss. And so this year there's a new little sliver that is paying for that $6 million loss that's being amortized over 25 years. And then the red line is the sum of the positive and negative amounts, and that's the actual amortization payment. And so over time, you know, you're going to pay off the unfunded, and as I mentioned, you can see it takes a while for the bars to shrink in an aggregate, and to you're paying off interest in the early years and much more principal in the later years.
So when do we anticipate that unfunded liability percentage to change, because it's been flat?
Yeah. We expect it, if all expectations were met, we would expect it the funded ratio to grow each year and the unfunded to go down each year, right? That's because we're paying off the loan. But as we have losses, we come up short. As we have gains, we come out ahead. And so when years you have gains, you may go from 70 to 73%. You know, you could have something like that. In years you have losses, you may fall behind a little bit. But you can see that those are the much smaller pieces that extend out when you expect to get to 100% funded. But, you know, over the next, what's now, I think, 24 years of paying off that transition, that's when you're going to make the big progress towards getting to 100% funded. And then plans that are nearly 100% funded always have we're above, we're below, we're above, we're below. And there are things we can do with the funding policy to tweak it so that we can reduce that volatility when we get closer, and maybe target something a little different than just right at 100% funded. So back to this one, right? This is comparing the contribution this year and last year. Again, it's comprised of the normal cost. You want to keep up with the growth in liability due to accruals, and the amortization amount, which is funding the prior shortfall in the liability. That's the reason you're below 100% funded, is that there is an unfunded that you're paying off. And the sum of those two is the total contribution. And then there are two funding groups. There's the employees and the employer. The employees pay 6% of payroll. So that's the $3.2 million last year and expected to be $3.5 million this year in what is labeled row 2. And so that offsets the total contribution, leaving the remaining amount for the employer to fund. So you can see it went from 11.2 to 12.1 roughly, or an $880,000 increase in the far right column. But as we discussed, payroll is expected to be $5 million bigger this year than it was last year. And this is pension payroll, not aggregate, so this excludes overtime and other components like that. So if you're thinking, hey, our payroll is bigger than that, you know, this is the pensionable pay.
Again, the reason for the employee decrease is what?
The reason for the decrease in the percentage of contribution is that the payroll grew. So when you take line 3 divided by line 4, you know, that even though line 3 grew by $880,000, that is a percentage of line 4 is smaller this year than last year. The employee contribution actually grew, or is expected to grow, from 3.2 to 3.5, not because it's changing, it's still 6%, it's just there's more employees and more pay, from which that 6% is collected. So that's the story. Not a lot of changes year over year when the contribution changes by less than 0.25% of payroll, but that, you know, is kind of obfuscated, or that result obfuscates all the changes that we just talked through. So that's the story. And so what we'll be talking about later is, you know, recommending that the contribution be reduced by roughly 0.25% of payroll this year. So again, this is just looking at a picture of employee and employer contributions over the last 5 years. We've stacked them on top of each other, so you can see that the employer pays the bulk of the contribution, and this is as a percent of payroll. And so the red employee contributions, that's 6% each year of payroll, and that's not changing. The employer is changing. And you can see that the employer contribution has been north of 20% for the last 5 years and has ranged between roughly 21 and 23% during that time, while the employee's been flat. And of course, 2024, we're only halfway into the year, and so those are expected. Well, the percentage is fixed, but the dollar amounts are based on expected payroll. This takes that graph and gives you a few more years of history going back to 2018, and it's just the employer side in the first couple columns. There's the actual determined contribution, right, where we say, hey, based on expected payroll at X percent, which is 20 point, whatever it is, 8 this year, we would expect 12.1 million in contributions. But then, of course, you're contributing based on actual payroll. So the difference between what's expected in the first column and what's actually contributed has to do with what the actual payroll was. So there's some fluctuation there between what's expected as a dollar amount and what's actually contributed, but it's the correct percentage. And the employee contributions, you can see, they've just grown with payroll over time as that's grown, but that's been 6%, although, 6% this whole period. So relatively stable growth in both employer and employee contributions over this period. So what's next? The action item from today's meeting would be that the pension committee, would recommend to the Board of Trustees to adopt a resolution to change the employer contribution to 20.816 from the amount it was last year, which was roughly right at 21. And by doing so, you will have contributed by the end of the year at least 20.8% of payroll, because up until now and up until this change happens, you're contributing a little more than 20.8% year to date. So that's the next step for the pension committee and the Board of Trustees. Then what else is next on our to-do list? We recently, at the end of May, provided the benefits department with the benefit statements. I know there's a big process in printing those and rolling those out and distributing those, so I don't quite know where that stands, but I know that is in the works. Whether they've been physically delivered yet or not, that process is well underway. So folks will have them soon if they don't have them already.
I did have a question on that because it was a question that came up
Yes.
a lot, and I was hoping you could explain in this forum. There's 3 columns, what you accrue now when you're eligible for drop via whatever rule mechanism, like Rule of 80, and then when the fully funded
Right.
would be. Can you explain when you're eligible via Rule of 80, what the penalties are by using that mechanism, like your accrual percentage?
Sure.
For a certain age?
So there's different, I'll just get it right in front of me so I don't misspeak. But there's different eligibilities for retirement under this plan. One of them is the Rule of 80. The other is age 65 invested. Let's see, I'll give you the full list. When you have 30 years of service, regardless of age, you can retire. And age 60 with 5 years of service, you can also retire with a reduced benefit. So normal retirement is considered age 65, right? But these other mechanisms, Rule of 80 and 30 years of service, you can retire without an early retirement reduction. So you get the full accrued benefit, whatever it is. So if I have 30 years of service, the formula would say I get 2.5% for the first 25 years of service and another 4% for the next 5. And so that works out to be something like 90%, of your final average pay. And so you'll get the full 90%. That's your accrued benefit, and you get it immediately if you retire at 30 years of service, regardless of your age. So if you're hired at 25 and work to 55, you can begin receiving roughly 90% of your average pay at age 55.
There's no impact to Social Security because there was a percentage taken off from that just normal calculation of 2.5 times years in the
Yes.
comments about Social Security?
So the Social Security, while it can't start until age 62 at the earliest, and there are reductions to your Social Security benefit for starting before your Social Security normal retirement age, which is age 67 now for most people. That's reduced, but your pension benefit isn't. Now, if I'm age 60 with, say, 10 years of service, I don't meet the rule of 80 because I only have 70 points, 60 and 10. I'm not yet 65, right? Or is it 62? It's age 60. The benefits reduce 3% per year because you haven't met the unreduced benefit requirements of rule of 80, age 65, or 30 years of service. And so there is a reduction there to your benefit. So in that example, if I had 10 years of service, the formula would say I get 10 times 2.5%, so 25% of my average pay. But instead of getting 25%, I could get 25% if I stopped working and waited to start receiving the benefit at age 65. I can get the full benefit, but I'm not getting anything between now and age 65. Or
If you do reach rule of 80, there's no 3% reduction per year.
correct.
Okay.
But there is a reduction. And so the statements show you what you've accrued today. They show you what your benefit is expected to be if you work until your earliest commencement date, which would be, we look at, hey, am I going to reach rule of 80 first, 30 years of service first, or I'm never going to meet those because I started later in my career here. I started at age 50, and I won't meet those. So then it might be age 60 we illustrate. And the last one is age 65. Folks over 65, we just show their benefit today. Some people only get 2 benefits illustrated because they're already eligible for 80 or 30. But
To clarifying, I want to make sure I heard that as well. So, and I could have this rule interpretation wrong, but, start at age 20, work till age 50. I've got 30 years of service, 50 years old. Is that rule of 80?
that's rule of 80.
And I'm set.
You
No
could-
reduction at that 50.
There's no reduction. You may not have accrued 100% of your pay yet, but if you,
There's no penalty.
there's
for
no
reduction.
penalty, right? And the idea of the penalty is simply you're paying it a benefit starting at an age earlier than when it's fully accrued, but you're right. And one thing we're going to be rolling out towards the end of this year is this pension portal, where it's an online-based estimation tool, where employees will be able to log in and see their pay history and see what their accrued benefit is today. And that day is not going to be January 1. It's going to be today, and they can go, well, what if I work until, let's say the person's 45. What if I work till I'm age 50? What if I work till I'm 52, 55? They can do any illustration they want, and then they can really start to understand, I've got 28 years of service. Look how much more valuable my benefit is if I work 2 more years, and get that rule of, or 30 years,
And are
or
drop calculations in that portal?
are there what?
Are the drop payments in that portal?
So we will keep track of those who are in the drop, but once you enter the drop, your benefit stops accruing. So what happens is, let's say I'm age 60 and I've been here 30 years, and I want to enter the drop. I have my full unreduced benefit, with 30 years of service in the formula, and I enter the drop, and so as part of that, I'm going to start getting monthly payments put into a drop account, right, for the next 5 years. I'm not going to accrue anymore, so for changes in pay, if my pay goes up, or I have an extra year of service, or 5 extra years of service, benefit's frozen now. But when I leave in 5 years, I will have 60 months worth with some investment interest on it paid to me in a lump sum, and I will continue receiving that monthly annuity going forward when I leave employment. So that's how the drop works. And so people who are in the drop, this isn't really going to illustrate any changes in their benefit over time, right? It's just going to show them, here's your drop, because they're considered, they're like a retiree in that sense, because the amount's frozen and, done.
I think the question gets full 5 years, so like they often ask, okay, if I'm done at this date, what would that payment look like?
Mhm.
So I just wasn't sure if that was built into the portal.
That's a good question. I think we can build that functionality into the portal. That's not part of what we're slated to deliver, but I think that's, I can talk to the programming guys back at the office and confirm that. But that's something we could add, I think without much trouble.
Just to clarify, I mean, Stephanie, come here. The drop person is fixed. It's already been determined. They're not going to change by taking, say, 3 years out of the 5 of drop. Their pension is been calculated, it's done, fixed.
Right. And so the calculation outside of, so when they enter the drop, the money gets put each month into LAMP. And that's in, I think, fixed income securities that are very short-term in duration. And so the return is 1% a year, you know, something like, I mean, it varies, but, and so it's roughly equal to how many months have I been in the drop times that monthly payment, you know, with a little extra on top, but they're not accruing a bunch of investment return.
Correct, it's more that straight formula that.
Right. So that's why we could add that functionality, but it's not a standard thing that's built into what we're building out right now.
It seems like even if it's not a function of the portal, that you could create a guidance document that explains to people
Absolutely.
how to calculate it.
Yeah,
pretty simply.
and that's very easy. We're going to post documents on there besides the how to use this tool document. One other thing that's going to happen is when we generate the annual benefit statements, they will get posted to the employee's individual account. So if we're generating the statements in May or April, instead of having to go through the process where you all physically deliver the copies, they will be immediately posted. So they can go on and click on a link for a PDF and they can print it themselves or just view it on their screen. But they have the added benefit of, okay, but I want to look at my benefit on June 7th, you know, as opposed to January 1. And the reason we use January 1 is that's the date we collect the census every year. And the reason we don't produce them till, you know, May or whatever is we collect the census, which doesn't happen till February, March, and then we have to scrub it and make sure we ask questions about, hey, you know, what happened to this person or that person? And, you know, is there something wrong with the census for that individual? And then we do the valuation and then we produce it. But it's going to happen a lot faster as we start collecting payroll feeds every month instead of once a year. So that's going to be automatic. And so it's going to really give people a more real-time view of their benefit while still generating an annual statement that has all the extra information in there. They're going to be able to do that, as well as the benefits department's going to be able to log in and run a calculation or an estimate for anybody who's considering retirement. So it doesn't just have to be done by the individual. Folks who are less facile with, you know, using a login and all that can come to the benefits department and ask for someone to run an estimate for them. So that'll be available as well.
Stephanie, can you introduce yourself and give us the status of the distribution of the pension documents?
Good morning, everyone. Stephanie Chambliss here, Benefits Manager. We are currently on site distributing the pension statements. Yesterday, we were at Carrollton Water Plant, so I heard you, Rebecca. We were there all day. We're on site all week at the multiple locations from 8 a.m. till 4 p.m., so we actually have a team over at Algiers now. We did receive a lot of questions. We were answering a lot on site. Rebecca, you did hit a lot of key questions that we received. So I'm hearing that if there are more, perhaps we could do on-site distributions again. The last count was about 300 we've distributed already. But if there still are a lot of questions, then we could do on-site distributions again so we can just get that hands-on approach and feel with the retirees, with the pensioners, with the active employees. Some other questions that I heard that I wanted to address, we talked a little bit about drop and what Mitchell was saying, and as well as Gray. Once those pension calculations are computed at retirement, that amount is set. And we try to explain that that is what goes into the drop account. And I understand that, we have to continuously explain that to our employees. So it's great that if there's a possibility that we can build that into the portal, that that would be an awesome mechanism for us. But in the meantime, if we do receive those types of questions from employees, we can do an estimate in-house in the benefits department, because the pension payments are what they are once they are calculated when people retire and go on the drop. So right now, we are doing those types of calculations in-house, and then we also let our employees know that LAMP is where the funds are being stored, and they can also contact LAMP themselves to receive information regarding their drop funds. And then, I'm
So
sorry.
employee questions are being addressed and handled through these meetings
Yes.
that you're scheduling?
Yes, we were, the first day, Monday, we were in the basement here at St. Joe from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., passing out the statements and giving employees the opportunity to review their statements and ask questions on site. It was the same thing at Carrollton Water Plant yesterday. We're at Algiers today. Tomorrow, we will be at Central Yard. And if there's still a lot of statements that we still have left, or if there are a lot of questions, then maybe in 2 or 3 weeks, we can do on-site visits again.
And can individual employees make an appointment with benefits to go over their potential pension benefits?
And yes, if there are additional questions, we do have a list of employees who need follow-up appointments with us. We're inviting them to meet with the benefits department starting next week to address additional questions, comments, and concerns. And then I heard Social Security being mentioned. We do pay into the Social Security system. A lot of people with pensions, other systems do not. We do. So when we get Social Security questions, we refer them to contact the Social Security Administration and talk about their individual pensions and our plan and how we do pay into the pension system. So that is primarily what we do. When we get Social Security questions, we direct them to the Social Security Administration. And then, are there any other questions regarding the retirement qualifications for employees? Because we do kind of see it almost like Social Security. If they retire early between the ages of 60 and 62, that's that early retirement penalty per se, just like Social Security. If your normal retirement age is 67 and you retire with Social Security at 62, there's that early retirement penalty. It's almost the same with us. They can retire as early as 62 without that early retirement penalty. And then all of the other qualifications that Mitchell mentioned would apply to employees.
Okay. Okay.
Any other questions or maybe anything I could clear up that we
Anyone else?
discussed before we move forward?
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks, Seth. So just in terms of what's next besides the things we've mentioned, we will be calculating the cost of living adjustments or the COLA, and we'll get that to you all in the next couple of weeks so that retirees get their annual, those are over age 65, get the annual COLA increase. If you're under 65, there's no COLA until you reach age 65.
Let me ask you, because I recommended last time we had this topic that we should be giving it to across the board to all the retirees. What would it take for that thing to be in effect?
So it would take an amendment to the plan to change who receives the COLA and/or the amount of the COLA, how it's determined. If we as the actuary are asked by the pension committee to do such a study, we would do that. And I say the pension committee, I don't know if that goes through finance too, you know, who approves a study like that. But any amendment to the plan that increases benefits, of course, is going to increase the employer contribution to the plan. And the funding policy, we talked about the amortization layers. The funding policy amortizes a plan amendment over a shorter period of time. And the reason being is you want the plan to be in a good funded position if you're increasing benefits, right? And so what is meant to ensure that you're in a good position or a good financial position to pay for that increased benefits is a shorter amortization period. And so that's how it will be paid for.
I want to be clear on what I thought I heard. If there's an adjustment to COLA, that would result in an increase to employee?
If the COLA was just extended to those under age 65, right, then there's going to be an increase in the cost of the plan because now the benefits are growing for current retirees under age 60, as well as we would add that to our calculations. We project the payment of future benefits for current employees and vested terminated employees. And so we would measure that obligation, change in the obligation, and it would be paid for as a increase to the actual determined contribution as a 15-year amortization of whatever that increase was. And so, yeah, that's how it would happen. And so I'm not.
Just want to be clear.
Yeah, and so before we would embark on that study, you know, Sewage and Water Board would have to instruct us to do so through whatever the mechanism is.
It would be the Board of Trustees.
The Board of
Trustees, yes.
And so, right, it might start with the pension committee recommending it or something like that to the Board of Trustees that such study be performed.
Would that be the process? Pension committee would have to
board.
recommend, or the Board of Trustees?
Board of Trustees, and we would do it in perhaps during the experience study.
Okay.
But it would also come with a fiscal note, of course, and it'd have to be recommended by our CFO.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there any dates yet for the experience study?
So that we're not scheduled yet. It'll be in the fall that we present. So the process will be, it's underway right now. So this is where we look at the last 5 years of actual plan experience, compare it to the assumptions that are currently being used, and then go, do we need to tweak any of these assumptions? I don't expect major changes this go round. We had big changes 5 years ago because the assumptions hadn't been updated in decades. And so, and if going back to that picture of the stacking everything on top of each other, you can see that those gains and losses are not enormous relative to the total obligation that we're amortizing. And so if we saw really big dark blue pieces, I would be saying something big is gonna change in the assumptions. So what I would expect is, we will recommend some changes to some of the assumptions, but nothing on the order of magnitude that we saw 5 years ago. And so anyhow, back to that. That's what we'll be doing. That's underway right now. We'll send a draft report, and the reason we do it in draft form, that's probably be early fall, September, October, to the pension committee, and then we'll come and present those results. And the reason we do it in draft form is there may be things like, most of what we're doing is looking backwards, right? But if we're told, hey, we've changed our compensation practice, or we expect to do this, we might go, okay, let's tweak our payroll growth assumption to reflect that. If you had, you were expecting a big change in the employee population for one reason or another, we'd factor that in to some of our assumptions. So that's why we do it in draft form. We want input from the Sewage and Water Board, and then we may tweak things a little bit from that point, present a final report, present the results of the experience study to the pension committee, where we are advising that, here's what we think should change. The pension committee accepts those recommendations. They recommend to the board to adopt changes to the assumptions, which would be reflected first in next year's valuation. So it won't affect any of the results I've presented today, but it will be built into next year's. And we'll, of course, do estimates of, hey, we expect this to have, change the employer contribution by 0.3% or whatever it works out to be. So you'll have an idea of the financial impact.
So do you expect any COLA percentages increase in your experience studies? Because previously it was 2%.
Right. So we look at the history of the COLA, and the COLA is tied to CPI or inflation, but there's a cap on it of 2%. And so we would never expect benefits to grow by more than 2% in a year, but it could be possible that we go, hey, we recommend a 1.75% assumption because there are some years where the COLA is below 2%. We've been, with inflation where it's been, we're at a 2% assumption. But there may be reason to tweak that, but not above 2, given the way the plan is structured.
Quick COLA question. Is there a disability trigger for exit or for eligibility for full pension benefit?
So there are disability benefits, and you have to have at least 10 years of service, and the board, you need medical approval and all that.
So the second part of that is, are they, that class as well as survivorship eligible for COLA?
Yeah, so the disability retirees are received, let me make sure, I think they still have to be age 65, but I have the summary of the provisions. Let me see if I can't find it real quick, I'll send you an email.
Yeah, we want to, no rush.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's any exception that is provided to those on disability.
And it's not 100%. I think it's at 75%, but we'll send you the actual
Oh,
provision.
so the determination of the benefit amount, yes,
Right,
there's
right.
that. But then once you're in pay status, you receive a COLA just like any other retiree. And that, as I'm seeing here, I don't see anything special or different for those under disability. So again, those are the kind of things that if you wish to explore, what if we, and the disability population is pretty small, and so the cost of that would be pretty small if it were applied before age 65, things like that. So that's where we are. I think we talked about the portal and the experience study and the COLA. So I think that covers everything. So that concludes the presentation. Any other questions about any of the stuff we talked about or anything else?
Any other questions from committee members? Okay, thanks, Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr.
So,
Baker.
one last question, sir. So as far as the employer contribution to the retirement is up to date,
Yes.
it's fully funded.
Well, the contribution that we determine is being fully contributed, right? And the purpose of the resolution that, that you all may recommend to the Board of Trustees is to change that contribution this year based on the results of the evaluation so that it continues to be funded actuarially.
Thank you.
Okay, let's proceed to the action item, Resolution R-110, 2024, to accept the 2024 contribution to the Employees Retirement System of SWEPNO. Gray?
The Resolution 110 accepts our 2024 actuarial valuation as just presented by Rudd & Wisdom with the estimated employer and employee contributions established within our funding policy to cover normal costs and amortization of the unfunded actuarial liability. Estimated cost of approximately $15.6 million will be covered by 6% employee contributions and 21% employer contributions based on estimated earnable compensation, very similar to prior year costs. And we appreciate the Pension Committee's vote to recommend approval by the Board of Trustees.
Okay. May I have a motion to approve Resolution
Aye.
R-110, 2024?
Aye.
Yeah,
Second.
second?
Second.
Second, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Public comment?
The public comment, Chair.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. You have an information item in your packet involving the Employees Retirement System. Any public comment?
No, Chair.
No public comment, then I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So before you adjourn, just the pension trustees, I wanted to discuss the upcoming election, because we have to have election on a conventional basis. And I would request the chair to request all the trustees to be in this room so we can discuss that, because it's coming up before any other meeting is scheduled. So we need to make sure the elections for the upcoming active employee is done the conventional way, not the way it's been conducted, because it is just like a Jim Crow era segregation where 275 plus employees don't have any computer to vote. So I would request chair to have this discussed for a couple of minutes so we can close this chapter.
This is not properly before the board or the pension committee. The pension rules and regulations dictate how the pension election is run, and we haven't had problems in the past. We have, most of the employees here have gone through that election process. But we have the Board of Trustees meeting, and we can discuss this matter, Chair, with our Director of HR and our Benefits Chair as well.
Okay.
No, sir, but on the other hand, anything related, as far as my understanding, maybe I'm wrong. As far as the rule dictates, it has to be decided by the Board of Trustees, Pension Board of Trustees. It
So-
has, no outsider can,
Chair,
what-
the pension rules and regulations can be reviewed. If there are any process issues, we can take that up with the Director of HR, as well as, we also have, and we can take this up at the Board of Trustees meeting.
Right.
There's a process that's actually been conducted in the past. If there are any rules or changes, then that can be taken up with the Director of HR and the pensions rules and regulations.
So in response to the question, it's going to be taken up and addressed by
Director of HR,
Director of HR and Board of Trustees.
yes,
Am I correct?
yes.
Okay.
so can you, if you don't mind, maybe I'm ignorant to
This
that
is-
rule.
So this
Can
is
you
not the proper,
contribute?
this is not on the agenda, and this
No,
is,
listen, this is one thing I'm vehemently against.
Yeah.
That we gotta have our trustees dictating the agenda. And I tried numerous times to put some items on the agenda, but it's never been put on.
I think the response was clear, that it's going to be addressed with HR representative and the Board of Trustees. Am I correct?
So that means it'll be put on the agenda,
Yes.
which is
So
what you're
it'll be
asking.
addressed.
No, but it was supposed to be put on the pension trust, from pension trustees meetings, not outside of it.
the rules and regulations of the pension committee, the pension rules and regulations dictate how the elections proceed,
And that's what we'll follow.
and that's what we must follow.
Okay. We have a motion on the floor for adjournment. Second? We have a second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed?